Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Your Compliance Learning Agenda for 2026. I am Naomi Grossman. I'm the Compliance Manager here at VinciWorks. And today's webinar is a special session in partnership with HowNow, a leader in learning technology. We'll be combining insights into the compliance landscape with the latest trends in L&D. I'm really excited to say that later in the webinar, we'll be joined by Nelson Sivalingam, the CEO and co-founder of HowNow. Nelson will share his insights on the future of learning. So these are things like personalized learning, data analytics and training, and embedding compliance into onboarding and leadership programs. Also, like I said, please do drop your questions in Q&A and chat. We'll try to answer them as we go or at the Q&A section at the end. But we really do want to hear from you today. We want to ask us any questions. We want to tell you about what's on your compliance learning agenda for next year. Also, just know you can always write demo in the chat if you want to see any more of VinciWorks compliance training. Now, we're really covering a lot today, but we also have a whole series of webinars coming up in January where we'll be taking a look at the big issues for 2026. And this is on a range of different topics. We have links to all these webinars coming up in the chat now, and you can register for any of these now or share them with your colleagues if it's more appropriate for your colleagues. Just know that all of these webinars are at midday UK time. And again, you can register yourself, share it with your colleagues, really all valuable topics for what's coming up on the compliance agenda in 2026. So just a quick rundown. We're addressing global compliance challenges in 2026 on Thursday, January 15th, UK corporate compliance in 2026 on January 20th, that's a Tuesday, health and safety in 2026 on Wednesday, January 21st. We're looking at the UK legal outlook for 2026 on Tuesday, January 7th. And finally, we're looking at data protection in 2026 on Thursday, January 29th. Again, register yourself, share them with your colleagues, but I think you're going to get a lot of value out of these webinars. Okay, let me introduce our VinciWorks compliance experts who are on the panel today. Joining me is Nick Henderson-Mayo, VinciWorks Head of Compliance, and our go-to experts on all things regulation and legislation. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Naomi. Great to be here. Hello to everyone, and really looking forward to our discussion today. An awful lot to cover.
Absolutely, and it's great to have you. And also with us is Ruth Mittelmann-Cohen, who is VinciWorks Head of Legal Compliance and deeply involved with what's coming up next year. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, Naomi, and hello, everyone. Thanks for having me back again. We've got a lot of interesting topics on the agenda today.
Great to have you here. And as I mentioned, we're going to hear from Nelson a little bit later. Nelson's segment will focus on how compliance training needs to evolve in 2026, from personalized learning paths and data-driven training to embedding compliance into everyday work culture. We're really thrilled to have that perspective because making training effective is as important as knowing what to train on. So one of the first areas that we want to discuss is what's on the horizon in terms of compliance topics you'll likely need to train your staff on in 2026. In the UK in particular, there are a couple of big ticket items that should be on your training agenda. So Nick, maybe you can start us off. What do you see as the top compliance learning priorities in the UK for the coming year?
I think the biggest challenge or biggest change really to think about is around cybersecurity, both because there's new regulation, but also because there's been so many cyber attacks over the last year, and it is a massive risk. So we do have a new piece of regulation that's already been introduced into Parliament in November 2025. That's the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill. So the bill is really going to expand the existing network and information security systems regulations as the NIS regulations. What this means practically is it's going to really increase the scope of who is covered by cybersecurity regulation and also increase how strict those requirements are. So currently, the way things are at the moment, there's only a relatively small number of operators of essential services are called, people in energy, transport, health, water, digital services who are currently covered. But the new legislation expands that to a lot more people who are going to have to think about cybersecurity, people who are dealing with data centers, people are managed service providers called MSPs under the legislation, and also a lot of critical suppliers to those essential sectors. So if you are a supplier to one of those critical sectors, you can expect to have to do more around cybersecurity compliance once the legislation gets passed. So there's going to be a lot more companies really going to fall under that umbrella of what's critical infrastructure from a cybersecurity perspective. And the legislation gives regulators more teeth. So there's going to be more power for the ICO and for the government to issue directions. If a cyber incident has like a national security risk, then the government could order a company to actually take certain specified actions. So be prepared for a lot more on cybersecurity over the next year.
Thank you for that. Really, really important to know. And Ruth, this really elevates cyber risk to kind of a board level issue if it wasn't already.
Yeah, exactly, Naomi. The whole thrust of really the cybersecurity and resilience bill is really to make cybersecurity a kind of core compliance competence and not really just kind of an IT issue anymore. It's really about baking cyber resilience into an organization's compliance program. So the bill will also impose kind of faster incident reporting so that companies in scope will have to report kind of significant cyber incidents to a regulator within 24 hours of becoming aware of it, with a full report expected to then be provided within 72 hours. So if we're thinking kind of from a training perspective, employees, especially those in IT, security, and kind of compliance roles, will need to know these new reporting duties and also how to actually recognize what is a notifiable incident. So there's a lot of new detail to train on, which systems are covered, what exactly must be reported, how to even implement the required security measures. And so even companies not kind of directly in scope might also be affected as well. So for example, if you're a supplier to a critical sector, you might be designated as a critical supplier and kind of be roped into the legislation in that way. So I would definitely say that one priority for 2026 is definitely cybersecurity and resilience training, and compliance teams should really ensure that their staff are aware of these new obligations, which we know are coming.
Thank you. Thank you. And really important, as we said. Now, cybersecurity has been on the compliance training agenda for a while now, but this really cements it as a top priority for 2026. We have a guide coming up in the chat that tells you everything you need to know about the cybersecurity and resilience bill. Really, really comprehensive guide, valuable information. The link is coming up in the chat now for you to download. Okay, let's get to our first poll question about this issue. And the question is, how frequently do you train your staff on cybersecurity? Quarterly or more often? Annually? Less than once a year? We don't currently run cyber training, or you're not sure. We really want to hear from you. Pop any comments you have about this, any experience you have about this in the chat. But let us know in the poll, how frequently do you train your staff on cybersecurity? Again, quarterly or more often, annually, less than once a year. We don't currently run cyber training, or you're not sure. Keep the poll open a couple more seconds. And again, pop in the chat if you have any comments about this. Okay, so this is interesting. 17% of you say you train your staff on cybersecurity quarterly or more often. Wow. 57% of you, over half, do it annually. 9% less than once a year. 8% don't currently run any cyber training, and 8% are not sure. So really interesting. And I see a bunch of you are commenting about how often you do it. And thank you for that. And if you need help with your compliance agenda for 2026, write compliance in the chat now, and one of our compliance experts will be in touch. Okay, now another big priority for training next year will be in financial services. Ruth, can you tell us what's happening there?
Absolutely, I'd love to. And this is quite a hot topic again. The FCA is effectively saying that culture and personal behavior matter just as much as technical compliance. So in July 2025, the FCA actually confirmed that it is extending its conduct rules to explicitly cover non-financial misconduct. So that means things like workplace harassment, bullying, discrimination, and this is across all financial services firms and not just banks, as we often think. And the change actually comes into force on the 1st of September 2026. And the idea is really to make it crystal clear that if you're, say, a financial advisor or a manager in an insurance company and you're engaging in serious bullying or sexual harassment, that behavior can now be considered a breach of regulatory conduct rules, and it's not just an HR issue anymore.
Wow. So do we know what that needs to include?
Yeah, so right now, the FCA is actually finalizing guidance on what actually counts as kind of serious misconduct and how firms should actually be handling it. And the guidelines are expected to come out pretty soon. But the FCA made it the expectation very clear that kind of firms should start reviewing and updating their internal policies and their training and their reporting systems already now, so they can start to get ready for this change. In fact, the FCA have even hinted that they'll be using supervisory tools like surveys and even potentially site visits to actually assess a firm's readiness and culture around this. So the goal is really here, the FCA want to drive industry-wide behavioral changes and not just carry out kind of a checkbox exercise.
Wow. Oh, those are potentially really big changes. And Nick, what does this mean for your compliance learning agenda if you are in financial services?
So I think if you're in financial services, you'll need to look at how you are rolling out or updating even training on things like workplace harassment, bullying, diversity, inclusion, and speaking up and whistleblowing procedures. Now, as we said, these topics have often been seen as HR kind of related training, but the change in how the FCA is managing this makes them a compliance concern as well as an HR concern. So an investment firm, for instance, need to ensure that everyone understands the bullying policies and codes of practice and how violating those could impact on FCA rules and then potentially put their career on the line. So that's where it's going to get complicated, and managers in particular will need training on how to make sure that they can foster a healthy culture, and also how non-financial conduct actions and factors can come into things like fitness and propriety assessments.
It's really really important to know. And even if you are not in financial services, harassment and workplace culture is a really critical area for 2026 with the Employment Rights Bill, isn't it?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of drama over the Employment Rights Bill that we might have seen happening. In fact, it's back in the Lords today. It's not been passed yet, and that's the key element, but we are expecting it to pass maybe today, maybe in 2026, we're not sure yet, but the fight over the Employment Rights Bill is over day one dismissal rights. Government has backed down on having a day one rights for unfair dismissal. We're expecting to see maybe a 6-month compromise. So there's supposed to be some progress on the Employment Rights Bill, not sure yet. But the important thing to note is that those are really only the critical or the aspects in contention. There are plenty other of changes in this legislation that are not in contention and that are kind of ready to go as soon as they figure out what to do around unfair dismissal. And one of these really critical aspects of the Employment Rights Bill is around sexual harassment provisions. It places a new emphasis on all employers to take proactive, all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment instead of just the reasonable steps that are currently required under the Worker Protection Act. So this means that you're going to have to do a lot more to demonstrate sexual harassment compliance than you were currently. Annual training at least for all staff, visible leadership engagement, clear ways to report harassment, documented responses. The regulators, the Equality Human Rights Commission, tribunals also are going to really expect evidence that you don't just react to any incidents that they happen, but you're looking at preventative action as well to potentially prevent, obviously things happening. That's the expectation under this. And for compliance and L&D in particular, this means that training and other aspects around sexual harassment prevention are going to have to be better documented, and you're going to have to take more action when the Employment Rights Bill eventually becomes law.
Well, okay, so we will definitely keep an eye on that, and I know VinciWorks will be providing regular updates as you've done, as the drama has unfolded, Nick. And Ruth, we've seen the regulator take some pretty serious actions against some pretty large companies who just aren't doing enough to prevent sexual harassment.
Yes, that's right. The Equality and Human Rights Commission has entered into Section 23 agreements with two kind of major high street firms, those being McDonald's and Lidl. In the Lidl case, a tribunal actually ruled that Lidl had failed to take all reasonable steps to prevent workplace harassment. And there's actually no evidence of staff training, no risk assessment, and really no effective reporting or complaint handling processes, even though they did have a policy in place and a policy did exist. As a result, Lidl signed a legally binding Section 23 agreement with the EHRC, really committing to regular staff surveys, ongoing risk assessments, enhanced training, monitoring of informal complaints, and in general, improvements to complaint handling and culture. McDonald's, as I mentioned, also recently extended a binding agreement with the EHRC to also overhaul its workplace culture. And this was after hundreds of reports of harassment and abuse were actually received.
Wow. So how can firms make it clear that they're actually taking action on harassment?
So employers must prove that they've actually taken kind of proactive, meaningful and ongoing steps and not just kind of issued a policy and just waited for complaints. And obviously training is central to this. It ensures that both staff, managers, everyone in the company and the business understands what is kind of acceptable behavior, and they can recognize harassment risks and know how to report concerns and also respond appropriately when necessary. Without regular, robust training, especially for kind of managers and leaders, other measures, even good reporting mechanisms or policies, do risk to be somewhat ineffective. So in short, given the Equality and Human Rights Commission's enforcement track record, really robust sexual harassment training is no longer a nice to have, and really it's become now a vital compliance and reputational safeguard.
So true. Thank you for that. Okay, let's get to our second poll, which is on this topic. And the question is, how would you rate the effectiveness of your sexual harassment training? Is it very effective, moderately effective, unsure, not effective, or you just don't do this training? And the question is, which is a really important one in light of what's going on now, how would you rate the effectiveness of your sexual harassment training? Very effective, moderately effective, unsure, not effective, or you don't do this training? And pop into the chat your thoughts on this. On how effective your company's sexual harassment training is, what makes it effective, what makes it ineffective. We really want to hear from you. Give the poll a couple more seconds. How would you rate the effectiveness of your sexual harassment training? Okay, so pretty interesting results. 20% of you say that your sexual harassment training is very effective. 34% say that it's moderately effective. 22% are unsure. 2% say it's not effective, which is very small amount. 21%, which is a fifth of you, don't do this training, which I think is also interesting result. So thank you for that. Now we've talked about what we might need to train people on. Now let's talk about how we train them. All this training is only worthwhile if it actually reduces risk and changes behavior. So, Nick, what does this mean in practice?
So for one, it means quality over quantity, I think. Rather than bombarding employees with tons of lengthy generic courses that they like to zone out of, a lot of companies have been looking at more targeted, engaging training and trying to make it resonate more. So I think there's it's about us shifting the business goal a little bit. So rather than saying 100% of employees completed anti-bribery training, actually, how do we go a step further and then think about how to prevent bribery and protect the company's integrity beyond just training? So I think also the more that training content is designed to connect with real life job scenarios and the risk employees face day to day, is going to be more effective.
Right. It's such a good point. So important to consider that. And Ruth, we're seeing more firms ask, how do we know if the training is working? Like, are we seeing fewer incidences, better compliance, maybe that people are speaking up more? What is it?
I think the answer is really all of the above, everything you said. We do want to be kind of combining the training completion data with the incident reporting data. The idea is that you want to look at the number of whistleblowing complaints, the number of possible policy breaches in an incident register or a gifts and hospitality register, and really add all of that up together and look at the trends that you're seeing. We saw with the UK's new failure to prevent fraud law, which came into force in 2025, that it's about having reasonable procedures in place to prevent fraud. So training completion is a part of that story, but it's not the complete story. And what we actually need to see is more collaboration, I think, between compliance and the broader L&D function. So instead of kind of compliance training living in a silo with an email saying, hi everyone, here's the annual e-learning training that you've got to be doing, it should actually be integrated into kind of overall staff development plans. So like kind of tying compliance goals to performance goals, or including even a compliance angle in leadership development programs as well. That if you kind of use mechanisms like this, it really ensures that compliance doesn't become this kind of tick box exercise, and it really becomes how a part of a business sees itself as succeeding.
Right. Those are such good points and so relevant to what we're discussing. And it's clear it's so important to make compliance part of the fabric of the organization. Like we often say the culture of compliance, but it really does come down to that, to daily habits, to the tone from the leadership, to really having be built into the fabric of the company. Okay, this is a perfect segue to bring in our special guest speaker, Nelson Sivalingam, the CEO and co-founder of HowNow, and the author of the award-winning book, Learning at Speed, and a co-host of the L&D Disrupt podcast. HowNow's learning experience platform is used by over 100 companies, ranging from fast-growing companies like Depop, Checkout.com, and Marshmallow, to global enterprises such as Sanofi and Investec, to create, discover, track, and manage all of their learning and skills in one beautifully smart platform. So, Nick, I'm going to hand the mic over to you and to Nelson.
Thank you very, very much. So, Nelson, great to have you with us. And I know we're going to see a presentation from you in just a moment once we get that working. But oh, there we can see it now. So thank you again for joining us. And you've obviously been in this arena for a very long time, and HowNow is working with so many different companies. What do you say is the top shift that L&D teams should be preparing for in the next 12 months?
Yeah, and it's great to be here. And you made me sound very old there, Nick, by saying I've been around for a very long time. I'm not that old. But really the big shift we're seeing is that move towards behavior and culture, really moving on, building on what you were mentioning earlier there. For a great way to kind of illustrate this is kind of a story that we're probably all familiar with. So this is my made-up character here, who's Sarah, who works in customer support. She's brilliant with people. She cares about what's right. She's completed all of her compliance training, every single one of the courses that's been assigned to her. But one afternoon, she's frustrated with a customer. There's a frustrated customer who comes on and says, "Look, I've already verified my identity. Can you just email me all of the account data now? I need it urgent." And in that moment, Sarah feels something we've all felt. The pressure, the desire to be helpful, to urge to kind of solve the problem quickly. She knows the policy, she knows the risk, she knows what training said, but she isn't thinking about any of that now. And all she's thinking about is that person in front of her and the urge to fix the problem. And that's actually the moment where compliance actually happens or doesn't happen. And that's really the problem and the shift we're seeing, where that is the moment we need to prepare Sarah for. But really does our approach, which is very content-centric, prepare them for that particular moment, right? And it goes back to that kind of behavior and culture. And so, I think there's a bit of a compliance illusion, and this compliance illusion is driving the shift that we're seeing, which is compliance has pretty much been built for courses, certificates, and completion rates. And, like you mentioned earlier, Nick, every organization reports back on 98% complete and 100% complete, etc. But what Sarah's story shows you is when the pressure's on, when someone's watching, there's no script and there's a bit of ambiguity that enters the room, what do people actually do? And the uncomfortable truth is most organizations today are compliant on paper, but probably non-compliant in practice, right? And we're just waiting for the moment for someone to go wrong. And the data supports this. Where, there's a study that came out earlier this year that showed, it was a multinational study that showed that compliance e-training found that most programs aren't evaluated at all. And where they are, they show little demonstrated impact on real behavior. And that's kind of further supported by an empirical phishing study, which found that studies on phishing training, perhaps the clearest behavior testing, shows traditional one-off compliance doesn't actually reduce real-world risky clicks long term. So, the shift for me is really, we don't have a training problem. We have a behavior problem.
I think that's really, really on point. And I think, the way you illustrate that is something that we're all really, really familiar with, that kind of example. And we've been hearing obviously so often about skills gaps. And the problem is, we don't have enough skills to do these things. How then can we in L&D make sure that the training that we are offering, because ultimately that's the kind of main tool that we have in this way to promote compliance. How do we make it more kind of a proactive mindset?
Yeah, I think the key word there, Nick, in what you said is actually skills, right? Because what we need to understand here is that the reason why in many organizations compliance might be failing is because we have a bit of a behavior gap where the compliance isn't influencing behavior. And I thought the FCA said this quite well, where they said, misconduct is really caused by deliberate wrongdoing or lack of knowledge. It's typically the result of wide range psychological, social, and contextual factors, right? And so what that basically means is people don't break rules because they haven't read them, right? They typically know the rules. They break the rules because they're under pressure. The incentives push them in the wrong way. Their peers are doing something different. It's easier. They freeze. They're afraid. There's so many different reasons. Now you combine them with systemic issues in the way compliance training is done, it makes the behavior get worse, where things like, you touched on this earlier, content is generic, right? It's aimed at risk mitigation rather than real world applications. Let's take something like GDPR. It's very different for me in marketing versus it is for someone in product, right? So how do you help me apply that in a meaningful way? And then, completions are rewarded. We essentially reward people for knowing, not even knowing, but just saying that they've completed it rather than behavior. And the learning is quite episodic, right? Versus actually the moments and risks is quite continuous. And so that's a change. And we're teaching rules. Actually, skills are about practice and developing and learning to apply them under pressure. And so really the key thing for me here is compliance isn't just about a module, right? It's building a muscle, and you don't build a muscle by going to the gym once a year, right? You build it over time, and it takes that kind of commitment to it. And so we really need to shift our focus from kind of content and completion to capability and culture. And the way to do that is skills, right? And so the new kind of compliance imperative here is really kind of asking a different question. What if compliance wasn't about rules and it was actually about capability, right? What if, going back to my fictional character, Sarah, what if Sarah didn't just know the policy, but she had a chance to practice it in a conversation, right? She had experienced that pressure before. So the first time she's experienced that pressure is not in the real world. And she built the confidence to say, look, I really want to help you, but here's the safe way I can support you, right? Compliance learning really should be about helping people, recognize risk, navigate gray areas, and communicate clearly, make confident decisions under pressure. All of those are skills, not just modules, right? And it's the skills that help you connect that learning to behavior. And when someone fails in a real moment, it's usually because they lack the skill, not because a policy didn't show up, right?
Yeah.
And I'll just give you a few examples of how that might look. So what you've got here is, some kind of high-level compliance requirements. And what's the behavior that might demonstrate that proactively, and what's the underlying skill there? So let's look at a few of these. Right? So you have data privacy. One of the behaviors might be around pushing back safely on inappropriate requests. Now, what's the underlying skill there? It might be assertiveness or it might be communication. So really what we're looking to do here is build that skill. Another example is around anti-bribery, where you might want someone to be able to recognize subtle coercion. Now, what does that look like from a skills perspective? It might be ethical reasoning and situational judgment. And then you've got speaking up. And that might be around being able to kind of report concerns. And the skills underlying that might be communication again, but also discomfort tolerance, right? If you're speaking up, you've got to be willing to be able to tolerate the discomfort that might come with that, depending on the culture of the organization. Then you've got conflicts of interest. Now, that's where you've got to be able to kind of disclose uncomfortable information. That requires you to have kind of self-awareness and ethical judgment as an underlying skill. And the last one is around, let's take customer fairness. This is where you want someone to be able to kind of avoid bias and ensure their decisions are kind of transparent. And that's where a skill might be empathy and active listening. Now, this is how you can see how that kind of compliance requirement can convert into skills. And that's where the partnering of compliance and L&D really matters, right? If we're going to take a more holistic approach, it's combining the kind of compliance training we're doing with the upskilling and reskilling we're doing from an L&D lens to ensure people are proactively building the skills required to be compliant.
That's such a really great way to put it. And I think that table is really, really fascinating. And the analogy of building a muscle is very, it makes a lot of sense. And obviously now we have new kind of tools. We've got AI, we have automation, that's, part of the picture now. So how do you see kind of L&D using some of these tools and maybe things like content creation or learning experience design, and also measuring the impact of how we use those kind of AI tools?
Yeah, sure. So, we're big believers that it's not about using AI for the sake of using AI. It's really looking at, what's the problem we're trying to solve, and does AI provide a more effective solution? So really looking at, again, if we really want to be able to connect the dots between learning and the skills and behaviors we want people to build, what's the obstacles in our way right now? Just to call out a few of the obstacles here. What you typically have is most organizations are still talking about policies rather than behaviors and the skills, right? And the problem there is although they know you need to do this compliance training, they don't necessarily know what skills does this person need to have in order to be able to behave in the right way. They're not breaking it down in that way. And some organizations who have worked on skills and mapping skills to the behaviors they want, typically those skills live in a spreadsheet, which means no one's using it, right? They live and die in a spreadsheet. And so it's just a waste of effort. No one's really aligned on the skills that are required. Another obstacle is going back to the kind of generic content, right? Everyone's getting the same training, whether you're a sales rep, a support agent, an engineer, and you don't face the same risks, but you're getting the same content, the same videos, the same quiz questions. So, relevance dies, and when relevance dies, engagement dies, and when engagement dies, behavior never changes, right? And that's what the problem is there. Another obstacle we have is people never get a chance to practice the hard moments, right? Compliance kind of breaks down in real conversations, right? Not in assessments and tests. And so people never get the chance to rehearse saying no, escalating a suspicion, or responding to pressure. They never really get to practice that. And so when it happens in the real world, they freeze, right? Or they default to whatever that moment pushes them towards. And the last one is really around how we're measuring this, right? And we touched on this in the earlier segment, where we're measuring completion, but we're not necessarily measuring your kind of development of that skill. We're looking at pass rates and how many people enrolled onto the modules, but we're not looking at, is this person actually better at ethical judgment, and how are we assessing that skill? Are they able to handle pressure in those moments? Are they able to communicate clearly when they need to? These are the obstacles that are really holding us back from proactively driving this as kind of skill development and behavior. And what I'm going to tell you is kind of a few different ways AI can really deliver on this. And this is how we're working with organizations to leverage AI to drive this. And the first one is finding those skills gaps, right? So one of the biggest challenges is knowing, so what skills is this person supposed to have, right? The table I showed you, that breakdown. It's a hard thing to do for every compliance requirement. And so what we do is essentially we leverage AI to look at real-time labor market data and to be able to map every single person in your organization to the skill and proficiency level they need to have, right? Now, this would have typically taken an organization 10 to 12 months to manually map, and they would have had to speak to every single manager, and every manager thinks their team is special, so they come up with a different name for a skill. And it's an absolute nightmare to do. We don't have to do that. We can leverage a large data set, labor market data, to be able to map what skills each person needs to have, but also what proficiency level. Then what we can do is we can use a combination of 360 skill review, so self-review, peer review, manager review, to be able to say, okay, on a 5-level proficiency scale, where do I think this person is in situational judgment, right? We can then combine them with AI productivity inference. Now, what that means is looking at your productivity and business data, so your actual work data, and using AI to infer, does this person's work data suggest they are proficient in communication or in ethical reasoning or ethical judgment? And so again, AI can very quickly help us continuously assess where people's skills are at. Now that you know where people's gaps are, you can now start to connect people with relevant learning rather than showing them things that they already know. There's a couple of different ways you can do that, where AI now can essentially help you curate the most relevant learning resources from, say, VinciWorks, with internal content that you might have around what does this mean for product and what does this mean for sales, to be able to curate and design a tailored learning pathway for that particular compliance requirement based on the role and function and skills gap that you have. Now, this would have just been physically impossible before. Right? Anyone who's ever built a pathway knows how much effort and time it takes. And not everyone has a view of all of the resources that are available. They don't know, they're not all learning experience designers. And this is where you've got AI that understands the best practices in learning experience design to do this in a meaningful way. And it's not just around structured learning, right? There might be things, industry insights that I need to be privy to. And this is where you can use AI to curate relevant knowledge and learning resources, continuously looking across the web and curating the most relevant things. Maybe something's just changed in your industry, right? And I need to get that update. And maybe that's in the form of a blog or a YouTube video. It might take you too much effort manually to be able to do this effectively for every team. But we can now leverage AI to say, okay, what does GDPR mean for sales? This new regulation that's come out, what does it mean for your role? And AI can automatically curate that. Now, where it gets really interesting is our ability to be able to practice this, right? And that's the gap right now, where we do a lot of our compliance training right now is about knowing. It's not about doing, right? And this is where AI can really effectively scale hyper-personalized practice and feedback. Now, this is where we have a tool called Guru, but essentially it's an AI work coach that's built on expertise like your kind of VinciWorks learning resources you've got, any internal knowledge base that you have. But what that means is it can repurpose that expertise into essentially practice scenarios, whether that's something like phishing or all the way to, how do you respond to this customer, right? And going back to my Sarah example. And it can simulate that based on your real world context and essentially nudge you, give you real-time feedback. So, rather than having to wait for your manager to give you feedback for someone else, it now scales hyper-personalized feedback to do it. Now, the last one I want to stop on there is, before we get to the analytics, is you can now use AI to also nudge people directly in the flow of work, right? Because that's where the risk is. The compliance risk is when someone's doing their job, they're in a moment where they need to make the right decision. And this is where you can use AI to automatically surface the most relevant learning resources and knowledge directly in the apps and tools where they work. Now, that could be any browser-based application or directly in tools like Microsoft Teams or Slack. Now, all this is great. How do we know it's making a difference? And this is where AI can also help us answer that question, where essentially you're looking at, rather than just looking at completion data and time spent learning, you can now use an AI analyst to ask questions around, are people building the skills they need to build? And have they got better at it? So let's take ethical judgment as one. What I need to do is go ask my AI analyst, has this person got better at this particular skill based on the 360 and the productivity inference? and it can essentially answer that question in plain English. So no longer having to export multiple Excel spreadsheets, pivot your data just to be able to answer these questions. You can now see, they are doing their compliance training, but also I can see the skills are getting better. So what that means is that I can essentially help us move away from box ticking to actually building a behavior change system at scale and reduce the manual effort to be able to do that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking us through that. There's so much great information there. I'm going to have you stick around with us for the Q&A at the end as well. And obviously, if you want to hear more from Nelson, then you can go to the website there, gethownow.com. But really, thank you, Nelson, for taking us through that. Really, really fascinating. I think now, Naomi, we're going to do another poll question and see what the audience thinks about how we integrate more of this into L&D.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a fascinating conversation. And thank you so much, Nick. Thank you, Nelson. And like Nick said, Nelson, you're going to stick around to answer any questions that come up at the end of the webinar. So please keep writing your questions in. And our next poll question is, are you making use of learning plans in your L&D programs? And the answers are yes, we use fully personalized learning paths for individuals, somewhat different training for certain different departments and roles. Not much. Most employees get the same general training. No, but we would like to introduce more tailored training and not sure. So the question is, are you making use of learning plans in your L&D programs? And really want to hear from all of you. And just remember, drop in any questions you have about this, any comments. We're going to get to them, and we'll get to any questions you have for Nelson also. Again, are you making use of learning plans or L&D program? Okay, really interesting. Only 9% of you said you use fully personalized learning paths for individuals. 40% of you, somewhat. You have different training for certain departments and roles. 32% of you say not much. Most employees get the same general training. 9% of you say you would like to introduce more tailored training, and 9% of you are not sure. So thank you for that, and interesting results. Now let's turn to one of the most challenging areas for HR, compliance, and L&D teams in 2026, and that is the issue of protected beliefs and freedom of expression at work. We've all seen the headlines, and the courts have been busy. Higgs, Forstater, Bailey, and on. Monday, we have the significant decision on the Sandy Peggy case, winning her tribunal against NHS Fife. The workplace has really become a bit of a legal battleground. So, Nick, why is this such a big issue?
Thanks, Naomi. So there's been evolutions in the law. There's been a various number of court cases, as we saw most notably the Higgs Farmer School decision, and that's changed the way businesses and HR in particular have to measure reputational risk arguments when dealing with employees who might be expressing either controversial or uncomfortable views. So under the Equality Act 2010, employees are protected from discrimination based on religion or philosophical belief. And that belief includes a wide variety of different beliefs, including things like the controversial gender critical beliefs, which the courts have confirmed as protected beliefs. And what's changed is how courts expect employers to balance those different beliefs with workplace culture and other kind of requirements under the Equality Act. So we had the Higgs Farmer School ruling earlier this year, which was quite a big turning point because the Court of Appeal made it really clear that you cannot discipline or dismiss someone just because their views are unpopular or controversial. You have to have a strict proportionality test. You have to figure out, was there actual harm and what happened? Was the risk of that harm more than hypothetical? And is the employer's response necessary and proportionate to achieving a legitimate aim? So in this Higgs case, the court said that the school itself, this farmer school, had failed that test. The employee who had posted things that were, controversial, but weren't offensive, and they didn't impact her work. And the reputational risk to the school was speculative. So that dismissal was unlawful, and because it reached the Court of Appeal, that gives us lessons that we should take back into our own workplaces as well.
Absolutely, yeah, it's really important to pay attention to that. And Ruth, this is actually where organizations start to worry. We want an inclusive culture, but we also don't want to get sued for restricting expression. So how are employees supposed to navigate this?
Yeah, that's exactly why this area, I think, feels so fraught. I think the key point here is to be able to distinguish between holding a belief, which is protected, and expressing it in a way that constitutes harassment, which in that case would not be protected. And I think that line definitely matters. And we've got cases like Forstater and Bailey, which show that employees can express gender critical views even online, and employers must not overreact or punish them without strong justification. Then at the same time, you have the Orwin case where an employee used a provocative pronoun policy protest in his email signature, which was sent externally. And that crossed into kind of unprofessional conduct and in fact created a reputational and service user risk. So dismissal in this situation was found to be proportionate. And then there's the Macareth case where refusing to use preferred pronouns in a role involving vulnerable service users fundamentally actually undermines the job requirements. So I think what we're seeing here is that the courts aren't really choosing sides in a culture war. They're simply asking what is the actual impact on colleagues, service users, and the employer's ability to actually function.
Really, really good points. And Nick, isn't this where training becomes just absolutely essential?
Really, really, really important, because so many of these cases hinge not on the belief itself, but on the manner of expression and what the employer actually does because of that. So managers need to understand those legal tests. Employees need to understand that, debate isn't harassment, but that certain behaviors, things like being sarcastic, ridicule, misgendering, aggressive language, all of that can cross a line depending on the circumstances. And what this Higgs really underscored is that employers must show they took a measured and evidence-based approach if this comes up. If you just jump straight to a suspension, a dismissal, you're very likely to lose at a tribunal. But you need to demonstrate you have clear policies, a proper investigation, a proportionate response, and then training to everyone that explains everyone's rights and responsibilities. Then you'll be in a much stronger position if it comes to tribunal.
Thank you. So, Nick, do you think organizations should expect more of these disputes in 2026?
I think we're likely to see more of this because belief-based claims are rising in tribunals, and actually it takes at least a couple of years for tribunal cases to kind of get to a conclusion. So I think we're going to see more in recent years that will come through, and workers also increasingly see tribunals as sometimes the only arena to resolve cultural conflict. And many of these cases will involve what people say on social media, outside of work, on personal social media accounts. But the Court of Appeal in this Higgs ruling was really, really clear that private expression is still protected unless you can prove actual harm. So without training, this is where people often panic, they'll overreact. They might think, well, this looks really bad, let's act quickly. That's exactly what's being pushed back on.
Such a good point. The panic creates so much of the kind of the overcorrection. Okay, Ruth, what should organizations actually do?
I think there are basically three essential steps they should be doing. Firstly, you should be training managers on the legal framework. They need to be able to understand protected beliefs, the Granger criteria, and the proportionality tests. Secondly, I think you should be training staff on respectful expression. So this isn't put here to kind of silence belief, but really to ensure that people understand where the line is between debate and harassment, particularly when different protected characteristics collide. And finally, have clear policies on social media, conduct, dignity in work, and routes for kind of early informal resolution. What we're seeing is actually most disputes are actually escalating simply because no one intervened early enough or constructively enough. So these could have been potentially prevented.
Excellent. Really, really, really good points. And thank you both for that. And this is exactly why equality and diversity training is going to be a critical part of every organization's learning agenda for 2026. Now, if you want to know all of the important cultural and religious days coming up in 2026, you can download our brand new inclusion calendar for 2026, which is coming up in the chat now. Link is coming up in the chat now. And this covers all of 2026 Inclusion Awareness Days. Okay, so now let's switch gears to another crucial training topic for 2026. And this is the important issue of sanctions compliance. So let's ask the audience about that first. And the question is, do you provide specific training on sanctions compliance? And the answers are yes, you have dedicated regular training on sanctions. Yes, but only for certain teams, like your finance teams, your procurement teams. Not yet, but you plan to introduce it. No, you don't have sanctions training, and not sure. So again, the question, do you provide specific training on sanctions compliance? And if you have regular dedicated training on sanctions, you have sanctions compliance training, but only for certain teams, or not yet, but you plan to introduce it. No, you don't have sanctions training, or not sure. Really want to hear from you. You can pop in the chat if you're satisfied with your sanctions compliance training, what you think about it, what you think about the concept in general. Really want to hear your thoughts. We'll keep the poll open a couple more seconds. Wow, so really interesting results. 22% of you have regular dedicated training on sanctions. 22% of you have training on sanctions compliance, but only for certain teams. So only 6% of you don't have, but you plan to introduce it. 34% of you just don't have sanctions training at all. And 17% are not sure. So it's interesting that so many don't have sanctions training. Now, sanctions compliance isn't just a financial services issue. Every organization, from tech startups to charities to manufacturing firms, needs to comply with sanctions regulations in the jurisdictions where they operate. Breaches can lead to enormous fines, criminal exposure, and severe reputational fallout. So, Ruth, start us off. Why is this something all companies should care about?
It's because sanctions actually reach into almost every part of modern business. They affect who you can work with, where your goods can go, what technologies you can use, and in some cases, even the software that you're actually using. In companies that trade internationally, you've got things like payment handling, working with distributors, and taking investments which could really unintentionally fall foul of the sanctions rules if you're not too careful. And we've seen some real consequences of this. In the US, we've got the Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, who's handed out penalties to firms that fail to screen investors or suppliers and third-party intermediaries. Even here in the UK, the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementations, OFSI, as we know it, has also become a lot more assertive. So we've got small firms and major corporations alike that have been fined for dealing with sanctioned individuals, potentially routing payments through prohibited banks, or simply exporting goods with potential military applications to restricted countries. And really what we're seeing is a consistent theme that the organization kind of lacked proper risk assessment, screening, or staff awareness, which is something that we should really be thinking about.
Yeah, seriously, like one mistake could cost millions, even if it's unintentional. So, Nick, talk us through the sanctions volatility piece, because this feels like a real challenge for businesses.
Yeah, definitely. Volatility is really the right word. The sanctions landscape has moved really fast. Lists can change every week, sometimes daily, and especially where things like Russia, Iran, Syria are concerned. And the Russia sanctions regime is one of the most active. And since the invasion of Ukraine a few years ago, the US, the EU, UK, all of them have released wave after wave of new designations. Banks, defense companies, logistics, technology, tons of different sectors have been added to restricted lists. And this creates a really difficult compliance challenge because screening systems that were accurate maybe a month ago might be out of date today. So it's really important not just to understand the rules, but also the pace at which things can shift and making sure you're doing frequent changes and updates.
Thank you for that. Really important. Okay, Ruth, what's changed in enforcement and regulation to make this a much bigger issue in 2026 than we've seen before?
Yeah, so this summer, the OFSI rebooted the entire enforcement system, and these changes, in essence, fundamentally change how sanctions breaches are actually investigated, assessed, and also penalized. So previously, the OFSI enforcement model left somewhat of a gray area, and companies often complained that it wasn't always clear how OFSI reached kind of these penalty decisions and how severity was measured or how cooperation actually affected the final outcomes. There was kind of discretion, but not always transparency. But one key change was that the OFSI now have added a criteria to how they actually score for breaches, including the harm or risk created, the company's compliance culture, the level of due diligence being undertaken, and crucially, the degree of knowledge and negligence that was actually involved. And this means that if you did everything right, you undertook due diligence, you trained your staff, you documented your sanction screenings, you'll be less likely to actually receive a monetary penalty. On the other hand, if you are missing any piece of the compliance puzzle, then you are more likely to be prosecuted if there is a breach found.
Thank you for that. Really important. So Nick, what's the key takeaway here for compliance and L&D teams?
So it's really important to remember the UK sanctions law operates on a strict liability basis for civil breaches. And that means a company can commit a sanctions violation, even if there was no intention to break the law. There's no requirement to prove there was any sort of knowledge, recklessness, even deliberate misconduct. You could receive £5 by accident, and that can still constitute a breach. We've seen penalties also for what a lot of people might think is just technical breaches. For example, a payment that was routed through a sanctioned bank when the counterparty itself was legitimate. Failures and also to respond quickly to OFSI information requests. These kind of cases to show that strict liability means that responsibility does sit with the organization. They do have to have the right systems and screening in place. The hard answer, though, is if you don't have a sanctions compliance program, that means you don't have ways to check clients, suppliers, customers, all of these people that you're supposed to check against the sanctions lists. You won't have a way to spot red flags, and you won't have the tracking and training to make sure that you can defend yourself if there's a potential sanctions breach, because it can happen to any company, and all companies are required to comply with sanctions.
Thank you for that. Really, really important points. Now we have time for just 1 or 2 questions. So Nelson, if we can bother you again, we have a great question for you. And the question is, what is the best way to ensure all staff adhere to a company's compliance policies?
Yeah, I think adhering to the compliance policy goes back to the behaviors, right? And I think that starts with understanding the breakdown of what skills people need to have demonstrate they're adhering to those compliance requirements. So a great place to start is just mapping skills to the behaviors you need them to demonstrate, and then understanding where their current level is. So I think that's where I'd recommend organizations start. And like I mentioned earlier, with leveraging AI, it's a lot easier lift than it used to be a couple of years back. So it's a good place to start.
It's a great answer. Thank you so much for that. And looks like that's all the time we have for today. So thank you to Nick, Ruth, to Nelson for your valuable insight. Thanks to everyone who joined us here today. And we really hope today's session has given you plenty to think about as you set up your learning agenda for next year. And thank you again for being with us. We really look forward to seeing you in January. Hope everyone has a Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah, and just a great start to the new year.